All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Albert Lilly. I am Vice President of Marketing for Quick Start. For those of you who don't know Quick Start has been involved in the IT skills and technical training space for over 28 years, and we are a Microsoft Gold Learning Partner. Our session today is Linux and open source on Azure, why it's and not or. Our guest speaker is Clyde Seepersad, who is the General Manager of Training for the Linux Foundation. I believe that the Linux Foundation needs no formal introduction. One thing before we kick it off, if throughout Clyde's presentation and discussion you have any questions, you will see a Q&A icon in your Zoom viewer. Just go ahead and click on that or tap on that and type your question in, and we've reserved a few minutes at the end of our session to address any questions. So this should take no more than definitely the top of the hour. And with that said, I will go ahead and hand it over to Clyde. Clyde, take it away.
All right, thanks for the intro. I'd appreciate everybody joining. What has happened has been, it's been a really remarkable last couple of years in terms of what's happening in the commercial ecosystem for software and the increasingly central role that open source plays in that. And in talking to Albert, we thought that given Quick Start's position as a gold partner, it might be helpful for his audience to sort of pull back and spend a little bit of time thinking about some of the implications. We're going to cover specifically some of Linux running on Azure. We're going to talk a little bit more broadly as well about some of the trends that are happening with open source. And as Albert mentioned, we'll come back, leave some question time at the end to go over. But I thought what I would do is I would start with a bit of a high-level overview. And so for those of you who are very familiar with open source ecosystems, just bear with me while I click through this. But I wanted to start by talking a little bit at a high level about open source software, and then talk a little bit about Linux, the Linux Foundation, to provide a sense of who we are and what we do and what our role is in the open source ecosystem. And then I'll transition into talking a little bit more specifically about the things we've been working with Microsoft on and some of the practical career opportunities that those collaborations bring to bear. But just as a high level, these are just some random stats. But really, if you look back over the past 5 years, there's been an increasing use of open source technologies across a whole range of computing environments. And so, I'll just kind of give you a quick rundown of just some of the top of mind open source projects that I jotted down as we were about to start here. It's things like Apache Web Server, PHP, Hadoop for big data, Docker for containers, Kubernetes for orchestrating containers, Cloud Foundry and OpenStack, which are cloud deployment suites that automate a lot of cloud deployment. A whole range of technologies in networking, so things like Open Daylight, Open vSwitch. AT&T recently announced that they're placing their entire telco orchestration project called eComp into the Linux Foundation. And then a lot of stuff that's happening that's kind of interesting and sexy. So for those of you who are familiar with things like blockchain, like Bitcoin and Ethereum, the underlying technology for that is called distributed ledgers or blockchains. And the Linux Foundation is hosting a broad effort called Hyperledger to address sort of what I casually refer to as Bitcoin for grown-ups. But how do you bring the power of distributed ledgers to markets beyond cryptocurrencies? So a whole range, you can see some of the stats up here, right? Millions and millions of lines of code, thousands of people contributing, billions of dollars in open source investment in open source companies, a range of unicorns, I guess, billion-dollar valuation companies, and across a broad spectrum of technologies. So really an idea that's really come into its own, and you start seeing, obviously, including companies like Microsoft with .NET and other platforms, seeing the power of collaborative development. But I also want to speak just a little bit to who the Linux Foundation is. For those of you who aren't familiar, the roots of the Linux Foundation is we're the nonprofit that hosts and maintains the Linux kernel. And Linus Torvalds, the inventor of Linux, is one of our fellows, one of our employees. He's still 25 years later, still maintaining the Linux kernel. But we're now increasingly going beyond just Linux, and the role we play is really a coordination role. So we bring together the technical steering committees that make technical decisions about these projects and where they're going to go. And those are separate committees from the business leadership's boards that each of these different projects has. And LF sort of acts as really a bit like Switzerland in the middle, coordinating a lot of input around commercial providers that see value in these new open source technologies on the business side, but then also coordinating technical discussions on the, from the developers who are contributing code. And sometimes the commercial side helps with driving adoption and some standardization around the tools. Other times we're more involved in the developer community. The most recent example of that was last year when we brought together, for those of you familiar with Node, so Node.js, there was a fork, two camps that were disagreeing at the code level, and we brought those camps back together, and they sort of reunited the fork under the auspices of the Node.js Foundation, hosted by the Linux Foundation. So we've gone from being kind of a single project foundation to really a foundation that is managing across a whole range of open source infrastructure. And the one I'd point out here is Google. And it's this middle quote here. I don't know if this is how widely known this is, but last year, Google took its Kubernetes platform, which is what it had used internally for orchestrating its container services, and contributed it into the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is part of the LF. And I think that was probably the most visible example yet of just the building momentum towards the range of projects that the LF is hosting. Speaking of that, I want to talk a little bit about the breadth, because we are about much more than Linux. Linux has obviously become pretty central. I'll share some slides here in a minute, just sort of showing some different stats on how far Linux has penetrated into computing basically everywhere except the desktop and laptop market. But it's about much more than just Linux. And I'll come to the middle and talk about the cloud piece, because that's obviously central to what we're talking about today in terms of Azure. But I'll start from the left, kind of move across. Security is a big one, right? Hopefully many of you are familiar with the Let's Encrypt project that we launched late 2015. 2016 was its first full year. And that puts together and makes available free SSL and TLS certificates to help secure the web. And in the first year of operation of Let's Encrypt, we saw the global share of traffic on the web that is HTTPS secured jump 10 percentage points from just about 40 to just about 50%. And we're looking for that to continue. And so that's an investment that we've made in helping make the internet more secure by making SSL certificates available at no cost. We're doing a bunch of stuff around networking. There's only one logo here for OP and a V, but there's really a very broad range of technologies, including things like Open vSwitch and eComp, which I mentioned earlier, which is the Microsoft, the AT&T contribution. There's projects like Open Daylight. There's a whole range of technologies looking at how do we take networking and pull it away from a hardware dependent and make it a much more software dependent ecosystem. And I think it'd be pretty easy to envisage the productivity and scalability benefits from doing that. On the right, on automotive, as of this morning, Daimler joined the Automotive Grade Linux project. This is a project to provide a real-time operating version of Linux that can run critical infrastructure in a vehicle. And it has got really broad backing. So in addition to Daimler, which joined today, Toyota is behind it, Mazda is Honda, Jaguar Land Rover, Ford, a really broad cross-section of automakers saying, hey, does it really make sense for us to all go reinvent our own separate wheel on the operating system that we're running the car with? It doesn't mean they're going to use the same skins and interfaces and GUIs and functionality, but it's a little bit akin to having a common chassis. And that's really going to move the needle here as smart car technology drives ahead over the next 5 years. And then finally, blockchain I talked about briefly earlier, the Hyperledger project. There's a ton of interest here, right? This is everything from being able to track land registries and blood diamonds through the more familiar financial services transactions. And, one of the stats that Brian Bellendorf, who is the head of this project, gives is that we can conduct a trade online in nanoseconds, and yet it still takes a week for funds to clear, which is a very bizarre thing. And the promise of distributed ledger technology is that you can really compress and make much more efficient transactions and trust online. So anyway, just a cross-section of projects hosted by LF, and I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end in terms of its implications for what we do on the training side and in terms of building capabilities for folks who are looking to broaden their tool set. But I want to just come back and talk about that middle column a bit, because the cloud is definitely somewhere that we've been very active. You'll see on the slide there, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is the nonprofit that LF is managing. Kubernetes was contributed to that by Linux Foundation, by Google. There are other components such as Prometheus and some other tools in there as well. But there are additional technologies. So Cloud Foundry, for instance, which is a sort of cloud on-demand technology that a lot of the big companies, IBM, GE, are using, is also hosted by LF, and really looking to create standardized tools that folks can use as we move away from a bare metal hosted world and into a cloud world where the big service providers are what folks use to drive their systems and processes. And so I guess that begs the question, right, of, okay, so what? LF has a bunch of interesting technologies. What does that mean for me? Assuming that most of you are probably coming from a corporate, Microsoft-heavy corporate environment. And I just put up here, and I'll speak to it a bit. This is an interview with John Gossman, who is now on the board of the Linux Foundation. So, probably you're familiar with some of the harsh words over the years that have got passed back and forth between the Linux ecosystem and the Microsoft ecosystem. We really have turned the corner on that. Not only is Microsoft now a platinum member of the Linux Foundation, John is also a board member. And as you'll see in a couple of slides here, there's a range of topics on which we are coordinating with Microsoft, because it's mutually beneficial, right? It's, I highlighted John's quote on here that nearly 60%, right? So nearly 2/3 of third-party IaaS offerings, infrastructure as a service offerings, open source. And as of January, this was nearly 1 in 3 virtual machines on Azure running Linux. I think the goal is for that to end 2017 by being more than half. And so you have this really interesting intersection of interests where Microsoft is really heavily committed to making sure that Azure is a really core central service for hosted cloud provisioning, and claw back some of the early lead that Amazon has built with EC2. And so that's a really heavy investment they're making, but they also recognize that a lot of the practice on the web has been to use Linux. I'll share some stats on that in a bit. And so it really tees up this world, right, where it used to be a world of OR, where you were either running OpenStack and open stacks like LAMP stacks for your web, or you were running Microsoft ecosystem stacks. And increasingly what we're seeing, and really because of the emergence of the cloud, is you're seeing a world of and, where it's a Microsoft Azure service. You might be running Linux on the VM, and then you might be running additional Microsoft services at the edge of that cloud. And so it's really trying to figure out what makes the most sense from the perspective of the economics, what makes most sense in terms of tools that are robust, reliable, easy to scale, and what the talent pool out there is familiar with. And Microsoft, you see the rest of the quote here, right? Microsoft has been very active working with Canonical, SUSE, Red Hat. I'll talk a little bit more about the distributions of Linux, which is sometimes a slightly foreign concept if you've come from a Windows world. But that's what those 3 companies provide. but they've made Bash open source. They've made they've made Bash available via the Windows command line. .NET's been open source. There's just been a whole range of contributions by Microsoft where they've really started to be much more encouraging of their customer base to do mix and matches of technologies for what makes sense, and that really then has implications for skill sets as an IT professional, and moving us away from this world of or and mutually exclusive ecosystems to a world of and. What I thought I would do here is I'll click through the next few slides, which really just provide sort of high-level color commentary on what some of the big drivers have been. This one's a bit of an eye chart. The point being, and this is not news to any of you, that desktop volumes and even laptop volumes are have really dropped off with the rise of tablets and smartphones, and we're going to start seeing, this sort of 90% coverage of tablets and smartphones. I know I do. When I'm traveling, I do probably 80% of my work on my smartphone. Right? It's amazing the kinds of apps that I can access, and of course, for the most part, they are all cloud-hosted apps. But that really that was sort of the leading indicator that things are changing in terms of computing and where computing gets delivered. Because obviously, as you move from a desktop to a tablet, a lot of the computing heavy lifting shifts off the device and into the cloud, which really started tipping the scales a few years ago. Again, this slide isn't going to be new for those of you who are in the industry, which is Android, which is really a variant of Linux that was acquired by Google from a company that had packaged it up, has a lead, and has actually started to grow the lead. I think this data is a little bit stale here from last year. And you've seen some of the more recent reports with Apple and iOS, and starting to see the slowdown now that they're topping out in China. But as tablets lead, tablets are increasingly an Android, which means Linux environment. And again, this again is probably not a surprise, right? That in terms of web servers, Linux has long maintained a very, very strong share. The Windows share ticks up when every time they extend the server edition life cycles, but you're looking at 3 out of every 4 web servers running Linux, which and the LAMP stack, right, which has become really sort of the de facto for a lot of companies. And then finally, in terms of stats and kind of where this all ties together for implications for folks running on the cloud. These are stats of the mix of distros on Amazon's EC2 program. You see the source at the bottom. This company called the Cloud Market has been tracking these stats for many years now. There's just a vast disparity, right? For every machine on EC2 that's running Windows, there are between 12 and 14 machines running Linux. And if you think about what that means in terms of the talent pool of folks that are out there who've got experience deploying in the cloud, it really is heavily Linux oriented. That's just what folks who've grown up on the cloud, the vast majority of folks who've grown up on the cloud have deployed. And that's what that's the type of stat that I'm imagining the senior team at Microsoft looked at and said, we have to be welcoming of Linux running on Azure in order to make Azure successful globally. Because you look at EC2, which is the 800-pound gorilla, and that's what they're running. So this is over 90%. For Microsoft, it's already 30%, right? It's that public stat that John Grossman was quoting earlier. Yeah, this is it's become the reality of how cloud environments operate, is this blended environment, and that then translates pretty directly into the implications for talent pool and skill sets, and as professionals in IT, what's going to be required for you to be successful in the next stage of your career as things move forward. And what we've done is we've started to really collaborate with Microsoft as the LF directly to say, okay, how can we help you, right? It's in your interest to make Azure as successful as possible. It's in our interest to make it easy for folks to run Linux on Azure as what has emerged as sort of the de facto standard. And the most public example that is available on this is the Microsoft MCSA Linux on Azure. This was announced just about a year ago. And it was really a unique approach. And it was the first time, I believe, that Microsoft has ever done this with their Microsoft certification program, where they said, okay, we've got, for those of you familiar, 7533 is the standard Azure certification that Microsoft offers. And what they did is they combined 7533 with our exam, which is LFCS's, well, you see it over here, Linux Foundation Certified Sysadmin. And they said, okay, if you can pass both those exams, both the Azure exam and the LFCS exam, which is the sysadmin certification from LF, then we're going to grant you the Linux on Azure MCSA. So this is not an LF program. This is just a core standard component of Microsoft's MCSA program, Linux on Azure. However, the requirement to earn it is that you take and pass the LFCS exam. And this is just a screenshot. Obviously, if you go to the Microsoft site and pull it up, you can see you get more detail when you click on the exam details button there. It actually takes you over to the Linux Foundation product page for LFCS, where you can find more information and sign up. The training is available for those of you who are familiar with Courseware Marketplace. Our training courses, as well as our certification exam vouchers, are available for purchase on Courseware Marketplace. So it makes it pretty easy because you can continue to use your one-stop shop for Microsoft assets and just go there and be able to access the exam as well as the instructor-led training. So we really have tried to make it as easy and as accessible as possible. And we'll talk about this a little bit at the end, but Quick Start also offers both the exam vouchers and training programs. In fact, Quick Start offers our self-paced online training program, which is a prep for the certification exam, which is a lot more convenient, a lot more affordable than the traditional instructor-led models, because you have 12 months of access to the material. Just to give a little more detail on the LFCS exam, it's a little bit different than what many of you might be familiar with in two primary respects. First, it is a fully performance-based exam, and that means that when you log in, you're going to get a live Linux environment, and you're going to get a series of tasks that you're asked to do, and you're going to have to actually do the tasks in the environment and demonstrate that you're able to manipulate a Linux system. There's no multiple choice on the exam at present, so it's not a knowledge recall exam, it's a hands-on practical exam. And that was in response to what we've heard consistently, which is, employers, especially for these newer technologies, what they really want to know is can you use the tool? And so we've put together this program so that it is 100% performance-based in terms of what you're expected to demonstrate. So that's one, performance-based. The second, and this does really increase the ease and convenience factor, is that it is delivered entirely online. So you don't have to go to a Prometric or a Pearson VUE Center and check yourself in and take the exam. You just need a browser, webcam, and a good internet connection, and you can take it 24/7. You basically go onto a public schedule, pick your time. It's not weekday 9 to 5. It's 24/7, 365. So you schedule it at a time that is convenient for you. You take it at a place that's convenient to you using equipment that you're familiar with. And it's proctored. There's a live human proctor who is observing your screen, is observing your webcam, is listening to your mic. And so it's got all the same types of protections that you would find in terms of a high-stakes certification exam, except that you have the vastly greater convenience that you're able to take this anywhere, anytime, from your own computer, from a location that you select, and bypass the old traditional model of having to go to a testing center. And we've seen really great adoption of our programs as a result of that change in delivery mechanism. So it is, it's a pretty different, a little bit different technology to use, but the certification piece is about as convenient as you could make it. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about and how we've gotten away from what I call the old world of sharply divided ecosystems, where you had Windows environments, Microsoft shops, and non-Microsoft shops, and very little value to going down the path of trying to cross-train, because essentially there's just not, there was no win there, because shops hired one or the other. And what you're seeing in this new world is that starting to change. We'll take some questions at the end. I'd be surprised if some of you haven't already started to see this playing out with companies using blended environments. I know firsthand of about a half a dozen companies that still run certain systems on their traditional hosted bare metal boxes that they are running mission critical systems on, but they've started to move other pieces onto Azure infrastructure. And so this is that hybrid approach of some stuff internally direct, some stuff on the cloud, and starting to run Linux on Azure for their cloud offerings, because that's where they can find people who have the skill set and experience with administering public clouds. And this last point, I think, is something that I've been reinforcing for folks as I've given some of these talks, which is some of the early feedback that we got after we launched the MCSA Linux on Azure exam was interesting, in that there was sort of this two-part reaction. Part one was, yeah, that makes sense, because a lot of what's been deployed on the cloud has been Linux. And so they can see the logic of why you'd want to, as Azure, why you'd want to be a Linux-friendly platform. But then the second part of the feedback was, oh, well, that's just not my skill set. And so, if my company goes there, what they're going to do is they're going to hire Linux experts. And that's been something that I've been kind of beating the drum on now for several months, is to say to folks, that's just not going to happen. Like, employers are just not going to go hire a whole new class of admins to run these blended hybrid systems, right? They're going to want the folks that they have to basically reach out and grow their skill set, because the economics of how this works is that they're not going to double their staff. They're not even going to increase it by half as much, right? They want folks to cross train. And I've heard that anecdotally as I've talked to some major employers. I think we've seen that practically if you look at some of the hiring patterns. And it's starting to pick up some more momentum. So I think the career implications for folks who are out in the field, looking at the shift to the cloud, looking at the embrace of open source and Linux by Azure, is really to say, okay, what does that mean for me? And I think increasingly what it means is we're in the world of and. We're finding ways to come up the learning curve on Linux, adding that to your skill set so that you're a dual threat on both platforms is going to be increasingly a way to future-proof your career. And I thought, yesterday I thought, okay, this would be an interesting exercise. I think most of you are probably familiar with DICE, major technology site for hiring. And I thought, well, let's just go take a look at what's out there. And you can see on the left, I did a search for Windows administrator. On the right, I did a search for Linux administrator. And it was eerie because they returned almost the exact same number of open positions, about 14,000 odd. That's a big change from just a few years ago, right? The demand for Linux talent is really growing, and you're seeing this, places, DICE, other job boards. You're seeing that same kind of trend. And the folks who are going to win the race, my belief is the folks who are going to win the race in terms of the talent pool are the folks who can do both. Right? It's not an or world; it's an and world. Another little bit of a data point here. This is an open source job report that DICE runs in with collaboration with the Linux Foundation. This is the 2016 version. Look at that number in the middle there. Right? 87% of employers, and this is not just open source employers, right? This is a broad survey that gets responded to by about 400 firms. 87% of employers say it's hard to find open source talent. So at the same time, here that you have pretty much equivalent job openings, the vast majority of employers saying it's tough to do. And for those of you who've been in Linux and open source, you probably know firsthand that if you've got Linux sysadmin on your LinkedIn profile, a week probably does not go by without you getting hit up by a recruiter. It's that much in demand. And then if you look down, it might be slightly harder to see, but the stat at the bottom right here, 51% of hiring managers say that open source cloud knowledge is the top skill that they're seeking. So, really is the centrality of the cloud to where people are looking to add skills in the future. So it doesn't mean they're going to abandon the stuff that they have. There's a lot of core services, things related to financial transactions, things related to security and privacy that probably won't move, but there's certainly a lot of things that are going to move. And I thought what I'd do next is just talk at a high level about some of the objections I hear as I talk to folks over the past year about what this transition looks like. How do what does it look like when you move from a world of or to a world of and? And there's a lot more. I just kind of put 5 up here just by way of illustration. And obviously we can take questions if folks want to ask some more specifics. But if we just kind of go through these, the command line focus, or the CLI, command line interface focus in Linux versus a more GUI intensive interface in traditional Windows products. Yes, that's true. It is also true, however, that a lot of the Linux distributions like Red Hat and Canonical do have GUIs that provide some feature functionality. But the reality is that if you're doing intermediate to more advanced jobs, even today, right, you're probably using things like PowerShell to run your cron jobs and to run queries and to do scripting. It's really not that different. The commands themselves are different, it's just really a different toolkit, but there's a little bit of this hesitation I hear at a high level from folks saying, oh, well, Linux is all about the command line and it's just sort of different and scary. And in fact, it's not that different, right? It's not that different from PowerShell. It's a question a little bit more of emphasis, right? Linux historically has emphasized the command line more heavily up front. Microsoft has probably historically emphasized its interface more, but both ecosystems have always used both, and that's one of the things I try to point out to folks, because I think that there's a bit of a myth out there around that. The second one is, yes, there are big differences, right? So there are things such as, in Linux, everything is a file, and that is true. There's things called file systems that you have to put together, and you have to do things like mount your drives. My take on that is that it's not unlike any other technology ecosystem, right? Which is when you come into it, there's certain principles that you have to learn that are big principles, but they're one-off. Like, once you wrap your head around them, you're done, right? It's just part of sort of the background of how these systems are constructed. And that's probably, that might be perceived as one of the more intimidating things as if you're cross-training into a Linux environment. But the reality is, nobody survives a IT and sysadmin career without being flexible learners, right? There's just been too much technology coming down the track. And at an accelerated rate over the past 5 years, where you're all learners for life. You've had to be, and so this is just another area where there's some big concepts that are quite different, and you just learn them like anything else. Hard to access the CLI in Linux. That's become increasingly easy to do. You can use PuTTY. You can run Bash, which is a scripting tool in Linux. You can run that natively. You can integrate to Active Directory. There's a whole range of tools and plugins that have come along, including many from Microsoft, to make it easier to run a blended environment where you're administering your traditional systems alongside your Linux systems, and you can access both relatively conveniently. SQL, time was it would require a lot of sort of jiggery pokery to get SQL running. That is no longer the case. It's now pretty readily installed on Linux if that's what you're running for your database on the back end. And then the variety of distributions. I think I'll spend just a couple of minutes on this because this has come up quite a lot. And so if I back up for a second, what the Linux Foundation does is we put out the Linux kernel, which is the core of the operating system that pulls together and drives the communication between the processor and all the peripherals and hardware, right? So it basically creates the glue to say, okay, I have input, output system, speakers, keyboards, terminals, hard drives, processor, and it creates the common language that routes and ties all those things together. And that's what LF maintains is the core Linux kernel. What you have in the Linux community is you have what's called distributions. And these are groups, in some cases, they're nonprofit groups, in some cases like Red Hat and Canonical Ubuntu, they're public companies. Well, I guess Ubuntu's they're private. And what they do is they take that kernel and they wrap it into a full operating system experience. So they add their own tools, they add their own GUIs, they add some functionalities at the margin, and they put it together into what you would consider a full-fledged OS like a Windows, where you can install it out of the box and have all the typical feature functionalities that you'd expect from a full-fledged OS. There are three major families of distributions, think, in the Linux ecosystem. There's Debian, which is where Ubuntu lives. There's Fedora, which is where Red Hat lives. And there's SUSE, which is where SUSE and OpenSUSE live. SUSE is a little bit more predominant in Europe. I think in the US, you tend to see more of Ubuntu and Red Hat. And there's hundreds of other distributions that are pretty specialized and that folks are, fans of. But, if you look at most small, mid-size, and larger companies, primarily what you'll find is they're probably running SUSE or Ubuntu or Red Hat Linux. And this is reflected in our certification exam. So that LFCS exam we talked about earlier, when you take the exam, you can select your distribution, and you have available to you OpenSUSE, Ubuntu, and CentOS. OpenSUSE and CentOS are sort of the fast follower versions of SUSE and Red Hat. And so we've made it as accessible as possible so that you can take any one of those three major distribution families. Regardless of which one you're coming from, you can select to take your exam on that distro. It's the exact same exam. The questions are identical, but the tool sets that you're going to be using, right? So you'll be using YAST as a tool if you're using SUSE. You'll be using apt-get if you're running Canonical. And so some of those different tool sets do show up. But what's happening is that you're starting to see more and more coordination and consolidation across the major distribution families on some of the tool sets. And so things like systemd, initially was sort of a bit of an outlier, and now all three of the major distro families are running it. And so there's still big differences, right? So Yum versus apt-get as tools for doing installs. That's true, those do differ by distribution. You get a little bit of differences sometimes into which text editors people prefer. But at the end of the day, you pick a distro and you go with it, right? And you get used to whatever the command line peculiarities of that distro are. And there's no right answer, right? What my guidance to folks is just, pick one, right? Pick one that, for, either, your ecosystem of folks is using or folks in your industry might be using. But there really is no wrong answer, right? If you look across the three major distro families, they are pretty widely used across a pretty wide variety of commercial ecosystems. So there's no magic right answer there. Pick one and get yourself up the learning curve. What you find in addition to the certification exam allowing you to pick your flavor, the training material that we produce at LF and which is available through Quick Start is also what we call distro neutral. And so we're not trying to tie you in and drive you down the path of a specific distribution. So that at a high level, there's always reasons not to. I think the data that I was sharing here a little bit earlier around what's happening in the jobs world in terms of talent pool and the shift to cloud hopefully shed some light on why you might want to consider an and strategy of broadening your talent pool. And then I just wanted to talk quickly at the end here about this is much more than just Linux. And again, I went back to that same interview that John Gossman gave, and I'll leave this up and you guys can write about it. But all these projects, Cloud Native Compute Foundation, Open Container Foundation, Cloud Foundry, these are all hosted by the LF, right? It's just different projects in the cloud space. And you can see John talking here about the variety of things that they need to support. Right, so some are looking to do container-based apps on Azure. Some are looking at to do that with the Azure Fabric Service. Some are using to do 12-factor apps. Just there's this broad range of things. And I think this last point is what's important, right? That flexibility is important. And I think that's the thing that I would encourage folks on this call to think about, which is how do you make yourself more flexible in the age of the cloud? And unsurprisingly, I suppose our suggestion is a good place to start is to go learn Linux, right? Add it to your tool set. It's a world of and, not or. The next slide, we talked about this a little bit, which is that there's a whole range of open source technologies. The reason this is important is LF is unbiased in that we're a nonprofit foundation that hosts these different projects. We don't have an economic agenda beyond our training, right? We don't have subscription services we're trying to sell on these products. We don't have support contracts we're trying to sell. We don't have hardware solutions that we're trying to sell. And so for folks who are looking to dip a toe and find out more about a Kubernetes and how it works on eComp or a Node or a Hyperledger, LF is a great place to start in terms of understanding and learning the basics. We tend not to go too far above into the intermediate and advanced levels because we find that there are always robust ecosystems of providers that do that type of work and that take people through intermediate and come on site and do some consulting type work. Our goal is to make sure folks have entry level capabilities on these projects and that it's done in a neutral way that doesn't try to steer them down a particular commercial path. And what you'll see is over the past 12 months, we've added a variety of training programs. Typically, they're self-paced online courses, so they maximize convenience and minimize cost. And they serve as an entryway to you. If you find out more, you take one of those courses, you find that this is definitely something that makes sense for your company. You may then go work with a boutique firm and do things that are more intermediate to advanced. But we're trying to position ourselves as the sort of Sherpa for your open source landscape to help you think about, evaluate these technologies. And we have a range of courses that are both free and paid courses. We have quite a few courses on edX that provide very basic level, entry level information. And I see Al asking folks here, because I'm getting ready to wrap up. If you have questions, please use the Q&A section in your Zoom viewer to get those in. And then this is my last slide, which is just, again, sorry, this is a little bit hard to see, but the point there is that there's a whole range. This is the current listing as of yesterday of the self-paced online courses that we have available. So basic Linux, Linux networking, Kubernetes, OpenStack, Linux security, software-defined networking, which is in the networking space. And you'll see about a half a dozen new titles coming online over the next 6 months or so. The ones I'd highlight is LFS 201. We have it in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. All three flavors act as prep for the LFCS exam, which is the prerequisite component of the MCSA Linux on Azure. That is available for Quickstart is a reseller of ours, but I guess little known fact, LF actually also uses Quickstart as our LMS. So when we sell our courses directly, we're actually using a white labeled version of the Quickstart LMS for all our course delivery. And we've been very pleased with that. And so, there's a very seamless experience as a user because you're going to get an identical experience via Quickstart as you'd have gotten if you were working directly with the Linux Foundation, because it literally is the same technology platform. And very pleased to partner with them both as a reseller partner, but also as a technology provider. Right, I need a drink of water. Thank you all. And I'll open it up, Al, for any Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much, Clyde. Just get this in full screen mode here. So just as we wrap up here, I hope everyone hangs on because I've got a pretty exciting announcement after we do a Q&A, but we do have one question that came in. So Clyde, if you can hear this question, the question is, I come from an environment that is strongly a Linux shop, so jumping to an and Windows ecosystem is a hard sell. From the Linux Foundation's perspective, how can a Linux shop take advantage of the Azure platform given EC2 and other Linux-friendly cloud platforms?
I guess what I would say is that there might have been a time when it would have been fair to categorize Azure as maybe not particularly Linux friendly, but that has really changed pretty rapidly over the past 12 months. So I'd encourage everybody to go take a look. I think at one point I had a slide in my deck showing some of the tools they have for things like deploying Linux, deploying Kubernetes. They have really made, Microsoft has huge strides in making Azure a much more welcoming place for Linux users. So it's become a lot easier. I think their program of how to learn Azure, the 70.533 exam that I referenced earlier, is probably a good starting point in terms of building capability. Because it's equally true in both directions, right? As Azure has become more welcoming and made it easier to deploy Linux, it's made it easier for folks coming from that sort of open source background to come over and do the cross training in the opposite direction.
Great. Thank you. So let's see, I don't currently show any other questions. So if anyone does have a question here, please do feel free to ask it, and we'll have a follow-up with the contact information here so we can you can ask any questions post this session. But what we'd like to do to wrap up and just as a special thank you for everyone who's attended, we know your time is valuable. We will be providing 3 things for you, for either yourself or a colleague or someone within your department or team. And that is, number 1, a 50% off voucher for the LFS 201 e-learning course at quickstart.com. It's a $250 value, so that's one. Number 2 is that five random attendees that are on this session now, we will send you through a random selection the LFCS 201 exam voucher. That's the prerequisite exam for the MCSA Linux on Azure certification that Clyde mentioned earlier. So that is a $300 value. That's the online exam. So, and lastly, we'll provide a 50% off voucher for any qualifying Quick Start Microsoft Official Curriculum Live course that's scheduled anytime through the end of March. So do check your inbox. We will follow up with a link to this recording, as well as to those who have been selected to receive the exam voucher. And again, we want to thank you for your time today. Looks like we're giving you back about 12 minutes for the scheduled hour here. And again, our contact information will be in the follow-up email should you have any questions, and we thank you again. So I hope everyone has a great short week, given yesterday was a holiday for many of us. Thank you again, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you, Clyde.
Thanks, Al. Bye.
Bye-bye.